Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. I present these videos weekly for a twofold purpose. The first of which is to take my brain out of prep mode as I think and ponder and work with the text for throughout the course of the week, and move into the mode of actually preparing and writing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation during the weekend. And the second reason for presenting these videos is just to allow you, the viewer, who have stumbled across this for whatever has brought you here, to just gain some different insight into the text as it is laid out. This particular Sunday, which is October 18th, 2015, the 21st Sunday after Pentecost, our gospel lesson comes from Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. Now, if you have caught the recent several weeks, we've really been focusing in tight on a specific portion of Mark's gospel, kind of chapter 8, 9, and 10, and 9 and 10 even more specifically, covering almost every single aspect of those particular chapters throughout the course of several weeks. And we've seen a lot of the encounters that Jesus has as he switches from his itinerant ministry around the region of Israel as he moves towards Jerusalem for the final week of his life prior to his betrayal and crucifixion. It's been just kind of ongoing as he gets ever closer, and that's kind of the norm for this time of the liturgical year, even though speaking liturgically, we won't get Jesus into Jerusalem until Holy Week, which won't be till next spring. So we're kind of coming up on a point where we'll switch out of that here towards the end of the liturgical year in about another month, just over a month. All that being said, there's been an ongoing theme in addition to just these encounters of what are called the Passion narrative, or excuse me, the Passion predictions within Mark's Gospel. And that happens three times: one in chapter 8, one in chapter 9, and then in chapter 10. We covered the first two predictions. They were actually featured within the gospel texts back a few weeks ago. Now, the third one that's here in chapter 10 is actually not featured, but it directly precedes where the gospel picks up today. And it, just like the first two, it's very similar. Jesus tells his disciples, or he's teaching them, that when they get to Jerusalem, he'll be betrayed and he'll be killed. And then on the third day, he will rise again. He always ends it that way. He always tells them that. And that is what directly precedes this particular passage. Now, in addition to that happening, we've also been seeing an ongoing theme about who will be great in the kingdom of heaven, who the kingdom of heaven belongs to, that we are called to be servants to one another. All of that different stuff has kind of been ongoing themes as we go through this section, this little period of Mark's gospel, and this period of the liturgical year that we're in. And that kind of plays a little bit into where we're at today as well. So picking up here again, the Passion prediction has just happened and Jesus just wraps up, and then we hear, as they're continuing along, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Okay, I'm going to stop there. There's more coming up, but I'm going to stop and talk about that portion right now. Okay, so we have James and John, two of the 12 disciples, and what I often refer to as two of the big three, the other one being Peter. Those three tend to be the ones, whenever Jesus pulls someone off separate from the rest of the disciples, it tends to be those three. We see it at different times, occasionally with healings that Jesus does. They're the three who happen to be pulled aside at the Garden of Gethsemane before Jesus is betrayed. He goes to pray and he brings those three with him and then ends up leaving them and moving a little deeper into the thing. But they're kind of called out at that point as well. And in addition, and I think important to note in this particular instance, is they are the three who are present at the transfiguration. When Jesus is up on the mountaintop and suddenly he is transfigured before them, whatever that looks like, and we don't exactly know, but we somehow his heavenly nature or his divine nature shining through the human nature in that moment. And Moses and Elijah show up and are talking to him, and those three are there. And what's interesting about that is Jesus instructs them after it's over, tell no one about this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. And I think that is important, that he ends his instruction about that situation with that when the Son of Man is risen from the dead, just as he ends his passion prediction directly preceding this, the Son of Man, or I will rise from the dead after I am killed. And so maybe this sparks off their memory of that. And because finally, after 3 times of hearing it, and each time they're like, what? Maybe it's finally starting to sink into them that something big is going on. Now, we don't know what's going on with Peter at this point. We have heard he kind of got slapped down shortly before this, after the second passion prediction, about a chapter ahead of this, when he tells Jesus, well, no, that can't happen. And Jesus is like, you're behind me, Satan. So I've had a lot of discussion with some other pastors about, is that a sign that, well, Peter's place in the 12 as kind of the spokesman is maybe in question at this point? And maybe it is, maybe it's not. We don't know what's going on with him. But regardless, James and John, who happen to be brothers, approach Jesus. Now, we hear this story also in Matthew. And in Matthew's account, it's actually their mother who makes this request of Jesus. And then he's like, dudes, and he starts talking to them directly when he asks them, are you able to do this? Here they ask directly, they make the request. And what are they asking for? Well, they recognize that Jesus is going to be great in the kingdom. And somehow, there's the whole Trinity thing here, and I won't go deep into that, but there's God the Father, and then there's God the Son, and they're 1 and 2 in the glory of the kingdom, because Jesus always makes himself subservient to God throughout his time of life and ministry, and the disciples have seen that. So now they think, when you come into your glory, whether that's heaven or whatever, or their earthly kingdom that they they kind of misinterpret things, whatever they're talking about, they're asking that essentially, if God's 1 and Jesus is 2, that they're number 3 and 4, sitting on either side of him. And so that's the request. And Jesus, I can only imagine, is like, baseball, guys, you still don't get it. It's not about being great. It's not about elevating yourselves, although I'm getting a little ahead of myself now. But Jesus, first he asks, are you able to endure what I am going to endure? And when he says, drink the cup that I drink, that it's thought that that's referring to death. And they say, up one side and down the other soon, that, well, yes, we'll go with you even to the point of death. And yet, of course, they all run away. But interestingly enough, Jesus himself prays to God in the garden, let this cup pass from my lips. And so that's kind of where we think that's referring to his suffering and his death. Then there's the whole baptism with which I am baptized. Now, again, is that death? Is that the Holy Spirit? Is that John's baptism? What is it? We don't exactly know. There's a lot of different theories, but essentially, it seems like Jesus is asking them, are you able to endure what I came to do? And they think they are, because they don't understand what it means. They don't understand what it's really about still. Now, is this also, then it goes on, and Jesus says, well, yes, you will drink the cup that I drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism. Is he predicting their eventual deaths? Now, James, is thought was beheaded. We hear evidence of that he is killed by the sword in the book of Acts. John is thought to have actually been the only disciple of the 12 to live into old age. He goes into exile to Patmos and is there, and it's thought that he just dies of natural causes, that he's not martyred. He's the only one who's not. So in that case, it's like, well, Well, maybe Jesus is talking about a brutal death, or maybe Jesus is just talking about death in general. We don't know. But regardless, Jesus says, well, yes, you will experience this, and whatever that means. But then what I really like is, but to sit at my right hand and my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. The Greek there is a little ambiguous. It could also be those who are prepared for it. And we, within Lutheran theology, we believe that Jesus' glory is in his death. His glory is the crucifixion. His glory is the cross, is dying on the cross. That's when he comes into his glory. It's not his resurrection. It's not his ascension back to heaven, but it is his glory is found in the cross, that brutal death that pays the ransom for all of us, for our sin, to redeem us. That is Jesus' glory. And who's at his right and his left? Well, it's two criminals that are hanging beside him. And that's a point that I always think is interesting, that it is not for, perhaps Jesus is predicting here that yes, you're going to die, and for one of you it'll be violent. The other one we don't know, but you're not going to drink it with me. It's not for you to be hanging from the cross beside me. And so maybe he's saying, hey, you guys are going to be gone for this. And we tend to look down on the disciples, but anyway, now why I brought up the whole passion prediction that precedes this, I think it's important to note that because it raises the question of what the heck were the disciples, and specifically James and John, like what were they doing when Jesus was talking about this just an instant beforehand? Were they arguing about who was actually going to ask Jesus? I mean, they're going back and forth like, you ask him, no, you ask him. We'll ask him together. Let's just go. And they didn't hear it that he's talking about that I'm about to die. That's and I mean, he says it 3 times. Clearly, it's important, and yet they miss it again, and they instantly like, "Hey, when you come into your kingdom, can we sit beside you?" I just think that's kind of funny, and it raises the question. And perhaps this is the direction that I'll go with the sermon. It's funny that I'm to that point, and I'm not even done reading the gospel yet. But is that maybe the point that I'll make that are we paying attention to the reality that Jesus died for this, and that's where the glory is found? And are we so busy trying to elevate ourselves? And now, why I'm thinking that, I'm going to go ahead and finish out the rest of the gospel, kind of make a little bit more sense that way. When the 10 heard this, basically that James and John had made this request, when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. Now that's actually, they became indignant with James and John. Same way that Jesus is described when the disciples have tried to block the children from coming forward to him, and he gets indignant with them. Now they are indignant. I mean, they are up in arms. They're going postal. They're angry with James and John. We don't know exactly why, and there's 2 different thoughts about why they're ticked off. One is, how dare you make this request of Jesus? Haven't you been listening to everything he's been teaching? And the flip side is they're mad because they didn't think to ask first. So either way, whatever their motivation is, they get ticked off about it. But Jesus called them together and said to them, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Okay, so this is where Jesus then cycles into the notion of quit trying to elevate yourselves. Quit trying to be that which you are not called to be. And that's why I really like that connection with the sitting at the right and the left as those who it is prepared for. God calls those 2 guys to be hanging next to Jesus for whatever reason. And we hear in the other gospel accounts, not so much Mark. Mark, we just hear it in passing. But in the other gospel accounts, we hear that one of them addresses Jesus like, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. So for whatever reason, they are intended to be there. James, John, not. Because they have a greater mission that goes on beyond the death and resurrection of Jesus. But Jesus is telling them, quit trying to be more than you are intended to be. Be who you are. And I think that's the direction that I'll go. And he talks about being a servant. And And he says that the Son of Man came to be a servant of all, not just the disciples, but the servant of all of humanity, that his life may be given as a ransom. And what's a ransom? Well, a ransom is something given to buy back a person who has been kidnapped, a person who has been captured. And we are captured by the power of sin. And Jesus' life ransoms us from that, frees us from it, pays a price to free us. And so I think that's the direction that I'll probably be going with the sermon of that Jesus' important reminder to be who we are. And who are we? We are people called to be followers of Christ. We are people called into the work of reconciliation that God is up to in the world through Jesus Christ. We are called to be a part of it, to participate in it. That's our calling, and we do so by serving. And that's kind of what's happening. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, throw those down in the comment section. We can continue the conversation that way. I always love to hear from you when those show up. Otherwise, hope you have a blessed week, and we'll catch you next time.